They thought the night would end in victory. An $800 million deal, champagne waiting on ice, and a room filled with powerful men who believed they already owned the outcome. But across that polished walnut table sat a woman they refused to truly see, a billionaire CEO whose silence made them restless. To them, she was just an obstacle, a foreign face dressed in elegance, someone to be spoken over and dismissed with smirks and careless insults. And moving quietly between the shadows of that dinner was someone else. A young black waitress, invisible, to the room, pouring wine with steady hands while every word, every insult, every cruel laugh burned into her memory. None of them imagined that the person they ignored most would become the voice they could not escape. Because when the moment came, the silence shattered, and the entire room turned upside down. The question is, who really held the power that night? Naomi Brooks was used to being invisible. At 24, she worked double shifts in a downtown San Francisco restaurant, balancing trays with the grace of a dancer and the silence of someone who had learned long ago that being noticed could cost more than it gave. By day, she sketched in worn notebooks, chasing dreams of art school she could barely afford. By night, she tied on her apron and stepped into a world where she was expected to serve quietly, smile politely, and vanish as soon as the plates were cleared. But Naomi was not ordinary. She carried a hidden gift that few knew about. As a child, she had lived in Japan with her mother, a diplomat who taught her the discipline of respect and the music of another language. Naomi spoke Japanese with the fluency of someone who had grown up in its rhythm. Yet in America, that skill rarely mattered. Here, what people noticed first was her skin. A young black woman behind an apron was not supposed to have stories worth listening to. Every night she moved through glittering rooms where wealth and arrogance collided. The chandeliers sparkled, the wine flowed, and men in tailored suits barely looked at her as they snapped their fingers for service. She learned to carry herself lightly, almost unseen, as though her very presence might disturb the perfection they believed they owned. The job paid for textbooks and kept her afloat, but it also reminded her of every door that had been closed. Every opportunity that slipped away because someone decided she did not belong. Still, Naomi endured. She carried herself with quiet dignity, holding on to the hope that her voice would matter somewhere, someday. Yet deep down, she knew the world rarely rewarded silence. That evening, as the sun set over the San Francisco skyline, Naomi was assigned to a private dinner unlike any other. The guest list included two of America's most powerful biotech executives, men whose reputations filled headlines, and across from them, a woman whose name carried weight in Tokyo's financial circles, Kamiko Hayashi, the billionaire CEO of a pioneering tech company. For Naomi, it was supposed to be just another shift. Fill glasses, clear plates, disappear into the background. But from the moment she stepped into that private dining room, she sensed something different. The air was heavy, charged, almost hostile beneath the polished veneer of crystal and marble. She could feel the undercurrent of tension in every laugh that lingered too long, every whisper that dripped with arrogance. Naomi did not know it yet, but she was walking straight into a storm. And when it broke, she would no longer be invisible. The private dining room was dressed in wealth. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across polished walnut, and the windows stretched floor to ceiling, showing San Francisco glowing beneath the night sky. Everything about the room screamed exclusivity, but beneath the shine ran something darker. Naomi noticed it before anyone else. The smirk, the careless tone, the way arrogance filled the air heavier than the scent of roasted duck. At the head of the table, Derek Caldwell, the biotech CEO, leaned back in his tailored suit like a king surveying land he already owned. Beside him sat Trent Langley, younger, sharper, meaner. His watch gleamed like a weapon, and every time he tapped his fingers against the table, it sounded less like impatience and more like a drumbeat of dominance. Across from them, Kamiko Hayashi, the billionaire CEO from Tokyo, sat perfectly still. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her indigo dress catching the glow of the candles. She hardly spoke, answering only in short, measured phrases through her aide. To Naomi, her silence looked deliberate, almost regal. but to the men across the table, it was an invitation to sneer. "Are we seriously negotiating with a statue?" Trent muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Derek forced a polite smile, but his eyes betrayed irritation. They spoke about Kamiko as though she were not even there. They joked about her accent, her pauses, her refusal to fill the room with chatter. Every insult was slipped like a knife, under the table, sharp but disguised as humor. Naomi poured their wine, steady hands hiding the fire in her chest. She had heard words like these before. In classrooms where she was the only black girl, in interviews where her resume impressed, but her face did not fit, in every place where silence was demanded of her, while disrespect was tolerated in others. Each word now was a reminder of that long history, and each time she glanced at Kamiko, she recognized the weight of it. The tension only grew. Derek raised his glass, toasting to a future without borders, his grin wide, his tone rehearsed. Kamiko gave a small nod, no smile, no words. The aide translated politely, but the stillness unsettled them. Trent rolled his eyes, snapping his fingers toward Naomi. "More wine, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with mock familiarity. Naomi obeyed, her expression calm, but inside she felt the leash in that word, the way it reduced her to nothing more than service. The insults escalated. Trent laughed about replacing Kamiko with a chatbot, saying they would probably get more interaction. Derek chuckled, pleased with the cruelty. Naomi caught the flicker in Kamiko's eyes, a wound felt, then hidden. But she did not move, did not flinch. Her stillness was armor, and Naomi saw it. She also saw how the men mistook it for weakness. Then came the breaking point. Trent leaned forward, enunciating every word like he was speaking to a child. "We want to buy your company, do you understand?" His tone was not business, it was mockery. Derek laughed beside him, suggesting maybe they should bring flashcards. Naomi's chest burned. She turned away, gripping the service station, counter so hard her knuckles ached. She wanted to scream, but the rules of her job pressed down like chains. Staff were not supposed to exist outside of service. Invisible, silent, replaceable. But as she stood there, Kamiko spoke softly in Japanese. Not to her aide, not to the men, but almost to herself. Naomi heard every word. "Is there no one here who sees me?" The sentence sliced straight through her. It was not just language. It was pain, familiar and raw. The ache of being erased in plain sight. Naomi knew it too well. Something inside her shifted, and suddenly the silence she had worn like armor felt suffocating. Her manager's hand landed on her shoulder, sharp and warning. "Don't get involved," he whispered. "Do your job." Naomi nodded, but her heart had already stepped out of line. The air in the room thickened. The men laughed again, louder, now convinced of their control. Kamiko sat still, but Naomi saw the quiet storm in her eyes. She moved. Slow, deliberate, every step echoing against the polished floor. Derek glanced up, irritated. Trent frowned. Her manager froze, disbelief plastered on his face. But Naomi kept walking until she stood at Kamiko's side. Then she bowed, deep and formal, not the shallow nod of customer service, but the reverence of someone who recognized true dignity. When she rose, her voice was steady, her Japanese crisp and flawless. She apologized to Kamiko for breaking protocol, but said silence in the face of disrespect was its own betrayal. If permitted, she would help. The room cracked open. Derek's glass hit the table with a dull thud. Trent's jaw fell. The aide blinked, stunned, but Kamiko's eyes softened, recognition breaking through her mask. She reached forward, touched Naomi's arm gently, and whispered back in Japanese, "Thank you for seeing me." And just like that, the balance shifted. Naomi turned toward the table, her voice calm but sharp as steel. She announced she would translate moving forward, ensuring Kamiko's words carried their full weight. Derek tried to laugh it off, but his voice wavered. Trent forced a grin that looked more like fear. Naomi opened the contract. She read quickly, her years of helping her mother with diplomatic briefs guiding her eye. Then she found it. The trap. She exposed section after section, vague clauses that would strip Kimiko of her patents, silence her voice in the industry, erase her from her own creation. Naomi explained it with precision, dismantling their deception word by word. Silence followed. Heavy. Cold. Derek's jaw tightened. Trent muttered, shifting in his seat. For the first time, they looked unsettled. But the night was not done. Kimiko gave a quiet instruction, and her aide pulled a small device from his blazer. With one click, Derek's own voice filled the room. Clear, undeniable. Plans to cut clauses, manipulate translations, dismantle her legacy. Trent's laughter followed, sharp and cruel. The recording ended, and the silence that followed was heavier than stone. Naomi translated the essence, though none of them needed it. They had underestimated Kimiko. They had underestimated her silence. And they had underestimated the black waitress, who now stood as the voice they could not ignore. The room no longer felt like luxury. It felt like a battlefield, and the men who thought they ruled it were cornered. But what Naomi did not know yet was that her act of courage would cost her more than applause. It would demand a price, and the night was far from finished. Naomi stood frozen as the weight of her words settled over the room. She had pulled the mask off their deal. She had cracked their arrogance, and for one trembling moment it felt like victory. But the illusion shattered when her manager stormed in. Foster's face was tight with fury. His eyes narrowed not at the men who had mocked Kimiko, not at the fraud just exposed, but at her, the waitress who dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You left your station. You inserted yourself into a private meeting. You spoke to a guest." His words lashed out like whips. Naomi held her ground, heart hammering, but she knew what was coming even before he said it. "You're done. Fired. Effective immediately." The words hung heavy, crueler than any insult Trent had thrown. It was punishment for courage, punishment for refusing to stay invisible. She had defended truth, and the price was her livelihood. Trent leaned back, smirking as if justice had finally been served. "Finally," he muttered. "Something in this place makes sense." His laugh was sharp, triumphant, the kind of laugh that made Naomi's skin crawl. Derek sat silent, his expression hard but shaken, unwilling to meet her eyes. The same men who had mocked Kimiko now watched Naomi stripped of her job for daring to stand. Naomi's throat tightened. She clenched her fists at her sides, steadying herself. A storm of anger and humiliation swirled inside her, but she refused to let them see her break. She had already given them too much. Foster pointed to the door. "Pack your things. Security will escort you out." The room shifted again. The same silence that had once been Kimiko's shield now pressed down like a sentence. Naomi looked at Kimiko, whose eyes held quiet recognition, even sorrow. But sorrow could not stop what was unfolding. The rules were iron. The hierarchy was merciless. And Naomi, the girl who dared to speak, was about to be erased. Her victory had lasted seconds. Now it felt like a trap snapping shut. Every eye was on her. The executives gloating, her manager seething, Kimiko restrained by composure. Naomi stood at the edge of ruin, her chest burning with fury she could not release. She had risked everything, and in return, the world was reminding her of her place. The power she thought she'd seized slipped like sand through her fingers. The contracts were still on the table. The recording device still gleamed in the candlelight. And yet here she was, dismissed, silenced, cast aside. It was not the fraud that brought the room to its breaking point. It was the simple fact that a black waitress had dared to stand, dared to speak, dared to shatter the illusion of power. And for that she was being cut down. Naomi took one step back, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo. Was this how it ended? With courage punished, with silence rewarded? The injustice burned so brightly it felt unbearable, and the sting of helplessness wrapped around her throat. But just as the room settled into cruel satisfaction, just as Foster's words seemed final, another voice cut across the silence, deep, steady, undeniable. "Actually," it said, "she's not going anywhere." The words carried across the room like thunder. "She's not going anywhere." Everyone turned. At the doorway stood a tall black man in a navy suit, his presence calm but commanding. His name was Mai Jones, a key partner in Kamiko's expansion into the U.S., someone powerful enough that even Derek's smug confidence faltered. For the first time that night, Naomi felt the weight shift back in her favor. Mai's voice was measured, steady, almost surgical. He explained that he had been in the main dining room listening to everything, the arrogance, the insults, the recording. And now, he was here to make it clear. Naomi was not to be punished for integrity. She was to be protected for it. Foster froze, his authority shattered in an instant. Derek looked pale, his control bleeding away. Trent's smirk disappeared, replaced by the hollow silence of someone who finally understood the walls closing in. The two men who thought they could bend the night to their will were now trapped by their own words. Naomi's chest tightened, not with fear but with something new. Relief, validation, the strange lightness of finally being seen. For so long she had been a shadow in every room, the girl who served, nodded, and vanished. But here, in the middle of the storm, her voice had altered the course of everything. Within hours the story spread. Whispers turned to headlines. Headlines turned to fire. The leaked recording traveled faster than any press release ever could. Investors demanded answers. Board members distanced themselves. And suddenly the men, who had mocked silence, found themselves silenced by scandal. Derek resigned in disgrace. Trent followed, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. Their fall was swift, their reputations crushed not by a rival company but by their own arrogance. And Naomi? She was no longer invisible. Kamiko Hayashi personally offered her a place on her global strategy team, not as staff, but as an advisor, a role that carried respect, education, and the chance to shape something bigger than herself. It was more than a job. It was an invitation to step out of the shadows she had been pushed into all her life. Yet the deeper impact was not measured in titles or contracts. It was in what the world saw through her story. A young black waitress and a Japanese billionaire had both been underestimated, dismissed, spoken over. One because of race and class, the other because of culture and gender. In one room, their struggles collided, and together they revealed a truth far larger than themselves. Silence does not mean weakness. Invisibility does not mean absence, and those the world ignores often carry the sharpest clarity. For Naomi, it was a lesson carved in fire. Courage had cost her everything for a moment, but it had also given her more than she ever thought possible. She learned that breaking silence is never safe, but it is always necessary. And for those watching, the story lingers as a mirror. How many voices have been dismissed in boardrooms, classrooms, restaurants, or even families? How many times has power been defined by who speaks the loudest instead of who listens the deepest? Naomi's story is not just about one dinner. It is about a world that still measures worth by skin, accent, and status. It is about how racism and prejudice do not always scream in the open. They whisper in jokes, smirks, and policies written to erase. And it is about how one act of courage can flip the script. So remember this. Real power does not always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it waits silently until the world forces it to speak. And when it does, everything changes. The question is, when the moment comes, will you stay silent or will you be the one who speaks?